This is probably what most people imagine when they think of conspiracy theorists. But that hat has become more like a symbol, and in many cases it doesn't serve any practical purpose. But not today. Today we're gonna need all the tinfoil we can get. Because we're talking about the scientific project that, according to some people, can control weather and even people's minds. Some of you could have guessed that I'm talking about the Haarp project. I briefly mentioned it in one of my previous videos. It is quite a story, so let's find out what Haarp actually does, what it studies, and where do all those conspiracy theories come from. My name is Andrei, and this is Cosmos Elementary.
So, Haarp is High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program.
Let's read about goals of the project on the old official website. Haarp is a congressionally initiated program jointly managed by the US Air Force and US Navy. The program's goal is to provide state-of-the-art US-owned ionospheric research facility. It's already becoming clear how even this description can give rise to conspiracy theories. For some who is not really familiar with all that, it might not sound very clear. Like, what? High-frequency research? Ionosphere? And on images like this one, the station might look scary. Who knows what they sent there? And it's also in a pretty remote location. What are they hiding? And of course the fact that it was managed by the military. So taking all this into account, it's not surprising that people began coming up with conspiracy theories. But as it usually goes, it's a bit more complicated. By the way, remember the description of goals I read? Let me read the rest of it. The program's goal is to provide a state-of-the-art US-owned ionospheric research facility readily accessible to the US citizens from universities, the private sector, and government. That doesn't really sound like a top-secret military facility. But before we go to the craziest theories, let's first figure out what the project actually does, what it's for, and how does it work. The project and what it studies is interesting in itself, and also this way it's easier to figure out why all of those claims are nonsensical. So Haarp studies the ionosphere. Let's start with that. Ionosphere is a layer of an atmosphere. You might have seen an image of atmospheric layers like this one. And what we see, or what we actually don't see, is the layer of ionosphere. And the reason is that it's not the same type of a layer like troposphere or stratosphere. Ionosphere stretches across top layers of the atmosphere, mesosphere and thermosphere to be more specific. It contains a lot of, well, ions? Charged particles that in this case form when ultraviolet and X-ray radiation coming from the sun interacts with neutral gas atoms and molecules in the upper layers of our atmosphere. As a result, electrons get stripped away from those neutral particles and they become ions. So those ions and free electrons act differently from neutral particles. So regions with larger concentration of those charged particles are described as separate layers. Lower layers of our atmosphere are not ionized all that much because most of the ultraviolet light gets blocked by the ozone layer. The ionosphere is usually divided in three regions. Layer D that begins at the altitude of about 70 kilometers, layer E at about 100 kilometers, and layer F at 150 kilometers and goes up to 500 or 600 kilometers or even higher all the way up to 1000 kilometers. Also, those estimates can be different because ionosphere is very dynamic and it changes all the time. Because the ionosphere is created by the sun and the sun itself constantly changes, as its influence on Earth, even during one day. During the daytime, when one side of the Earth is illuminated with the sun, more ions are created and less ions recombine with electrons forming neutral particles. The opposite is true during the nighttime. More neutral particles occur. So as a result, the lower D layer usually completely disappears during the night. Properties of remaining layers also change. Ionosphere is also affected by other factors like changing solar activity, seasons, and even weather down here on Earth. Most auroras occur in the ionosphere, so that's why it's called Auroral Research Project. But auroras are not the only thing that glows in the ionosphere. There's also the air glow. It's a weak constant glow in our atmosphere and it can be seen on photos like this one. Sometimes it could be even seen from the ground, and the glow is caused by various processes. For instance, when atoms and molecules excited by the sun release photons to dump extra energy, and in the process of recombination. When ions recombine with electrons, photons are released and we see light. So ionosphere is very dynamic and interesting place. But why is it so important to study it? People often ask, why do we even need to study the universe? Its large-scale structure, faraway galaxies, what does it have to do with us? What's the point? Sure, not all of the scientific studies, especially fundamental ones, have obvious, immediate, practical results and benefits. But that's not what those studies are conducted for in the first place. In the case of the ionosphere, there are actually a lot of very practical reasons to study it. Firstly, the ionosphere and its condition greatly affect work of some communication systems. For instance, before widespread use of satellite communication, over-the-horizon radars were in use. Radio waves, as any other kind of electromagnetic waves, travel in straight lines. When we transmit a signal, the receiver has to be in the field of view of the transmitter. But there is a little problem. The Earth? Well, it is not flat. And at some point, the receiver can be hidden by the horizon. Of course, the taller the tower, the farther its top becomes visible, but we can't just constantly increase height of towers. That's why in the 50s and 60s, over-the-horizon radars were built. The thing is that the ionosphere can act as a kind of virtual mirror. Radio waves reflect off of charged particles in the certain layers of the ionosphere back to Earth. This is how a signal could reach regions thousands of kilometers away without use of satellites. That's one such system in the US, and that's the Soviet station. They were also used to detect launches of intercontinental missiles. Imagine if the Earth were actually flat and those stupid engineers and military people wasted so much time and money in the effort to send signals over the horizon, and all they needed was just to send them in a straight line. How dumb of them. But in all seriousness, it should be clear that to be able to use the ionosphere in this way, we need to understand its properties and how it behaves, especially because it is so dynamic. It's good to be able to forecast its changes and to know how, let's say, a solar flare would affect the communication system. Nowadays, satellites play an important role in communications, but the problem of ionosphere is still there. Satellite signals go through the ionosphere where they can get absorbed and reflected. The changing conditions of the ionosphere can affect the quality of transmissions, and it can also affect GPS systems. And that's not all. Satellites in low Earth orbit and the International Space Station are basically in the ionosphere. Charged particles affect their operation as well. The atmosphere there is really thin, but it is still there and it slows the satellites down, which is why they eventually deorbit. The International Space Station requires altitude rise maneuvers with its thrusters. The ionosphere that constantly changes, its density can increase, and that affects the longevity of satellites. To sum up, a whole bunch of modern important technologies need to account for the ionosphere, and that's why we need to understand it. It shouldn't be surprising why the military was so interested in the HAARP. Radars, communication, satellites, and that's not all. One of the main reasons for those conspiracy theories, the involvement of the military, is explained pretty easily. The official description of the project goals state that the gathered data could improve civilian and military communication and navigation systems. But now let's talk a little about the station itself. I touched on what it studies, and there is an interesting word in its name. Active. HAARP might look like many mother radio antenna arrays. The important distinction is that HAARP can not only passively receive signals, it can also actively affect the medium it studies and then measure the results of that. HAARP consists of two main parts. The first one, and perhaps the scariest one, is the Ionospheric Research Instrument, or IRI. It's a phased antenna array. At first, it consisted of 48 antennae, and later the number was increased to 180 antennae with 360 transmitters. It requires 3.6 megawatt of power and works on the frequency range of 2.7 to 10 megahertz. Let's briefly talk about phased arrays. As I've said, the station has 360 transmitters. Very roughly, you could compare a transmitter to a regular light bulb. Both emit electromagnetic radiation, though at different wavelengths. A light bulb is similar to an isotropic radiator. Mostly it radiates in all directions. But if I want to send more radiation in a certain direction with the same energy input, I could use, let's say, a reflector. just like the way it's done in flashlights. And that is of course a simplified example. The similar thing is done to radio transmitters. I also should mention that even the simplest dipole transmitter is not actually isotropic. So in this case you could use a dish to increase antenna gain. This way we focus the beam and make a signal stronger, and also it allows us to change the direction of the beam. If we need a powerful instrument, it becomes more and more difficult to operate a huge moving dish. But there is another way to control the beam. Use a phased antenna array. A lot of smaller antennae are arranged in a certain configuration and they all transmit signals at the same frequency. The interference occurs, and because of constructive interference, the main beam occurs. And because of destructive interference, on its sides the signal becomes weaker. Actually, it's a bit more complex than that. This is an example of an antenna with 16 transmitters, and we can see the main beam as well as some smaller ones. So what's also important is that using such a system we can change the direction of the beam simply by changing the phase on separate transmitters. Basically add a little delay and that allows to change the direction. In the case of the Haarp, there is a complex system that allows to change the angle and also the shape of the beam, and even create multiple beams. To sum up, this way we can control the beam without the need of building a large mechanically controlled dish. So the instrument warms a small region of the ionosphere up. Radio waves excite charged particles, they start colliding with each other more often, and the temperature increases. That's why it's called the ionospheric heater. The IRI creates irregularities in plasma of the ionosphere. It can create a virtual antenna which sends back to Earth lower frequency signals, and it was even supposed to be able to create artificial auroras. The second big part of the station is the whole set of various instruments to observe the effects created by the antenna array. It's magnetometers, instruments to study the ionosphere, to receive signals, cameras, a telescope, and so on. All that can passively work even without IRI. But obviously the most valuable data is received when the research is active. The array affects the ionosphere, and the instruments observe and record the effects, and scientists analyze the data. That's in short. Obviously there is a lot more to it. Let's also talk about the history of the project. It also added some fuel into the fire of conspiracy theories. During the decades of Haarp's operation, it had been managed by various military departments, until it eventually became a part of the University of Alaska. The project was conceived at the end of the Cold War era, and the main idea that brought actual funding to the project was communication with submarines. When they are deep underwater, they avoid detection. But the deeper they go, the harder it gets to communicate with them. It is possible to do so using very low or extremely low frequencies. They could reach deep underwater or even underground. But the problem is, those waves are hard to generate. You'd need huge facilities which are difficult to build and operate. But I've already mentioned that you could create low-frequency waves by reflecting radio waves off of ionosphere. And those low-frequency waves could reach submarines. It was proven to work in the 80s. At the same time, Over the Horizons radar were being closed down, and the physicist Dennis Papadopoulos was trying to gain the support from the military to create such a station. The scientists would have their atmospheric heater for research, and the military means to improve the communication with submarines. At the same time, Senator Ted Stevens was interested in additional funds for Alaska. So that's when everything clicked together and the project saw a green light. But the main motivation that helped fund the project changed multiple times. When the Cold War was over, work on such a submarine communication system became not all that urgent. There were ideas to use low-frequency waves to find underground bunkers, but many were skeptical about it. When North Korea got their hands on nuclear weapons, there were concerns that they could detonate a nuclear bomb high in the atmosphere and the stream of electrons could break lower Earth orbit satellites. So it was supposed that Haarp could make the natural process in which those electrons are neutralized faster, though it was not clear if it would even work. So during the years of Haarp's history, the military had various interests in the project, while the scientists conducted their own studies at the same time. And there were a lot of studies, a lot of new and unique information about the ionosphere. It would take too long to name everything, but that includes new data about the dynamics of the ionosphere, about plasma waves, generation of low-frequency signals. Artificial aurora was actually created, and it was even visible with the naked eye. This is an actual photograph of that. New data was used to improve satellite communication and GPS. That's the list on the official website of scientific papers that were written based on Haarp's data. And that's not all. New papers are still written. Here you can see recent papers in Astrophysics database. And the military finally completely lost interest in Haarp, which would be weird if it could actually cause earthquakes and control mines. In 2014, the decision was made to close the Haarp down and even to demolish the whole station. But fortunately it was not, and the University of Alaska became in control of the project. And the research is still ongoing. You could even submit your own research, and if it's actually worth it, it could be done. You can also access the whole database of observations, so even if military was involved at some point, the project is still quite open. Perhaps Haarp conspiracy theories wouldn't be that popular if it were not for a couple of people. I didn't make this video to specifically debunk conspiracy theories about Haarp. I was interested in the project itself and what it studied, and yes, also some wacky theories on the side. It doesn't take a lot of effort to debunk it. For most of you, saying that it supposedly controls weather, people's minds, destroys planes, and creates earthquakes at the same time would be enough. Why do some people still believe that? There are internet articles, videos on YouTube, TV shows, and even books that claim that Haarp is a secret weapon. Let me bring some examples of that, and they are of course highly speculative, but what is worse, many of the claims are simply false. For instance, I've seen a documentary that had claims like this. Quote, "It is one of the most unusual facilities in the world. An endless array of antennae." They show some aerial footage of Haarp, and the narrator says, "They take up 60 square kilometers." Wait, what? I believe just by looking at pictures like these, it's easy to say that there is no way it is 60 square kilometers of antenna. We can even check it. Use satellite imagery and the ruler. So it's about 350 meters wide and 420 meters long. And that's 0.15 square kilometers. Not 60. I don't know, maybe they meant the area of the whole complex, but no, they specifically said about the antenna. And then the narrator says, "It's like a one huge antenna, and when it's turned on, it sends a 1.5 billion watt beam of radiation into the sky." 1.5 billion watt? 1.5 gigawatt? We already know that its power is 3.6 megawatt. For what they claim, you would need a quite big power plant. And Haarp has only several generators on site. So basically they just said that the size of the array is 400 times larger than the actual size, and its power is 500 times larger. Not surprising that it would sound scary. There is one more interesting point in that documentary. They claim that European Parliament released a resolution where they acknowledged Haarp to be a global problem. The resolution where European Parliament expresses concerns about Haarp actually exists. First of all, the existence of the resolution itself doesn't mean much, and it cannot be a proof in itself. But I'll get back to that, the whole thing is actually pretty funny. But there are other questionable sources of information. For instance, in this article on Gaia.com, which has nothing to do with the Gaia Observatory, the following is stated. Critics of Haarp assert that it has the capacity to send microwave radiation beneath the ground. No, it doesn't have that capacity. Have those critics even heard of the frequency range in which Haarp operates? It's far from microwaves. And also, have they not seen the photos of the station, photos of antenna? You know that the frequency of waves that transmitter is able to transmit depends on a physical size. Basically, Haarp's antenna cannot physically create microwaves. And most of their arguments are like the ones I've just talked about. Haarp causes earthquakes. Do you know who was among those who claimed that? Who is that expert? Hugo Chavez. He blamed the 2010 Haiti earthquake on Haarp. But how do they attempt to prove that it's actually Haarp to blame? Well, they claim that since the Haarp began operations, earthquakes started occurring more frequently. But did they actually? Let's check. Well, not really. The number varies from year to year, but that's what's expected. And there is no sudden increase in the number of earthquakes after Haarp began operations. But wait, you could find a graph like this one, and it apparently shows such an increase. But you could also find this article, which very well explains where this graph comes from. It actually shows only selected earthquakes. And if we account for all of the earthquakes, it starts looking like this. there is an increase, but in no way that sharp. And if we look at a longer period, we can see that it's quite natural, rises and declines. Okay, how do they explain the mind control thing? They say that brainwaves and the HAARP have the same frequencies. The frequency of those brainwaves is in several hertz or tens of hertz. But we already know that HAARP operates in the range between 2.7 and 10 megahertz, if they mean the lower frequency waves that HAARP creates in the ionosphere. For instance, in this paper, the registered radiation was between 0.5 and 3.5 kilohertz, so it's way higher. But even if those frequencies were exactly the same, how would that prove that it could actually control minds? How about some, evidence, some research? Oh, by the way, there is evidence. Edward Snowden leaked documents that prove that HAARP does mind control. But the thing is, that's fake. There were no such documents. This reminds me of panic over 5G. And here, again, the minute you figure out how it actually works, it becomes clear that it cannot physically do what it is claimed to be able to do. And when it comes to the weather control, that's what's written in the FAQ on the official website. Yes, they even had to include those questions about weather and mind control. They explain that because HAARP creates radio waves and they are not absorbed in the troposphere and the stratosphere, where, all the weather is, it doesn't affect it. Also, the energy of HAARP is actually pretty low when compared to natural phenomena. But you know what else occurs in the atmosphere but is much more powerful? Lightnings that strike like 50 to 100 times a second across the globe. HAARP warms a little part of the ionosphere up. But you know what else warms the ionosphere up? The sun. Okay. The thing is that HAARP creates changes in a tiny portion of the sky. Those changes are small, way smaller than what the sun does. But because it can be controlled, it is easy to register. So no, HAARP cannot control weather. There is no evidence that it could cause floods, hurricanes, and other disasters. Remember, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence and all that. Well, here there is obviously no such evidence. HAARP is not even the only atmospheric heater. Similar, though less powerful instruments were in the Soviet Union and in Europe, but only HAARP has become that infamous. In the previous part of the video, I said that two people had played a big role in all that. Whenever you read or watch something about HAARP, two names usually pop up: Bernard Eastlund and Nick Begich. Eastlund, a physicist who worked for oil and gas company Arco. He also used to be a consultant in one of the companies that work on HAARP's construction. The whole story is quite long and there is a good article on Wired about it. I'll leave a link to it. What's important for us is that Eastlund filed for several patents. And in those patents, he described a technology similar to HAARP, but it was also described to be able to destroy missiles, control hurricanes, and all that. Those ideas were thought to be nonsensical by others, but still later he claimed that HAARP was built based on his patents. But patents cannot be used as a proof that something actually works. You could basically write in them almost anything, and yet his patents are most likely among the main sources of the conspiracy theories, but they don't prove anything. The second person is Nick Begich, the son of a politician in Alaska. His father went missing after a plane accident, and neither the aircraft nor bodies were ever found. As Wired article writes, after that Nick Begich became interested in different sorts of mysteries. And then he saw an article about HAARP in a conspiracy magazine, and also patents with quite big claims, and that the military were involved, and it only escalated from there. And he wrote a book called Angels Don't Play This HAARP. Pun is definitely intended. It was translated in more than 10 languages and sold over 100,000 copies. In a Vice News interview, he said that he earned about $1 million selling that book. Pretty good motivation. He also started giving talks at various events, from ufologist conventions to the hearings in the European Parliament. Remember the European Parliament resolution? So, a conspiracy theorist, for some reason, who was presented as the doctor. But I haven't found any signs of his scientific works, neither in Scopus nor in Google Scholar. The last one shows only his conspiracy articles, and I haven't found anything about his degree. And also the author of books who earned good money on them. So this person was an expert at European Parliament hearings. These are the documents where he is mentioned. Also, mass culture helped popularize the idea. The similar station was described in Tom Clancy's book, and there it created psychosis. Something similar was in Marvel Comics, in X-Files, and in Stalker games, and so on. All of that might seem funny until it is not. In 2016, 2 men were arrested. They were planning an armed attack on Haarp. That's the arsenal they had. What inspired them to do that? Conspiracy theories. And that's not all. Staff of Haarp regularly receives threats. And all that for what? There wasn't a lot of secrecy in the first place, but perhaps because Haarp's staff became tired of all those claims, they began hosting open houses. They opened their doors, and basically anyone could come, have a tour and learn what they do there and see everything for themselves. And a lot of people went there. And you know who didn't go there, according to himself? Nick Begich. Having spread conspiracy theories to so many people, he said something like, "What have I not seen there?" Thanks for watching. Links to all of the sources are down below in the description, and if you enjoyed the video, leave a like, comment, and subscribe not to miss the new videos. Bye!